All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Greetings, my name is Josh Bruce, and on behalf of the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, I want to welcome you to our first webcast in our series focusing on earthquake recovery and mitigation that we'll be holding over the next year. Before introducing Jay Wilson, our featured presenter, I want to briefly tell you a little bit about CREW. The Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group is a coalition of private and public representatives working together to improve the ability of communities throughout the Cascadia region to reduce the effects of earthquakes and related hazards such as tsunami. CREW's goals are to 1. Promote efforts to reduce the loss of life and property damage from earthquakes, 2. To educate and motivate decision makers, managers, and the general public to reduce risks associated with earthquakes, and 3. To foster productive linkages between scientists, critical infrastructure providers, businesses, and governmental agencies in order to improve the resilience of communities after an earthquake. For more information about CREW, I encourage you to visit our website at www.crew.org. And now on to today's webinar. The title of the webinar is Magnitude 9.0 Paradigm Shift, Post-Disaster Reconnaissance of Tohoku, Japan. The presentation will highlight the catastrophic impacts from a magnitude 9.0 earthquake and tsunami that hit coastal areas of northeastern Japan. Discussion will address the loss of emergency and other government functions and observations from the perspective of a local emergency manager from Oregon. Will Oregon make this paradigm shift before or after the coming Cascadia event? The webinar is being presented today by Jay Wilson. Jay Wilson has been a professional emergency manager since 1997, and his career has focused on hazard mitigation. He has been the Hazard Mitigation Coordinator for Clackamas County since 2008, and he currently serves on the Oregon Seismic Safety Policy Commission. Jay has previously worked for Oregon Emergency Management as the Earthquake, Tsunami, and Volcano Program Coordinator, with the Federal Emergency Management Agency as a reservist for community outreach and education for mitigation, and he also has worked for the cities of Oakland and Berkeley as an Earthquake Program Coordinator. Jay holds a master's degree in geography and a bachelor's in film. So without further introduction from me, I'd like to bring Jay Wilson on, who will be presenting today's webinar.
Thank you, Josh. Good morning. I appreciate so much the opportunity and really the honor of being selected as the person to kick off this webcast series for CREW. This presentation is one I've given a number of times since I returned from the visit that I had to northeastern Honshu in June, and I'm very happy to share this with as many people as I can from the perspective of a local emergency manager who's bringing back what I think are very important issues for consideration for the Pacific Northwest, especially when we someday in the future will have our own version of the March 11th earthquake and tsunami that affected Japan. I also want to say thank you and my appreciations to the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute for allowing me to be a member of this social science reconnaissance team. I worked with an amazing group of people who were on this trip with me that I won't go into naming everyone, but CREW has posted links for the report that we issued for government and societal impacts, as well as a personal blog that I had posted on the EERI Tohoku site. So with that, I'll get going, and we'll be available for questions via the moderator after the presentation is over. When I've given this presentation, I like to start with a video clip that I had shot when we were in Minami Sanriku, a small coastal community in Miyagi Prefecture. But it's so hard to bring back the visceral experience of actually being there, and this is my best attempt to try and have kind of an emotional entry point for this presentation. So I'm going to play this very short clip and just narrate a little bit about what you're seeing as this is playing. And I hope it's going to be a little jittery because it's a high-definition video. Our group was there in the third week or so of June. It was just after the 3-month mark, about 100 days out, and there was still so much evidence of the damage and the intensity of the tsunami, not to mention the debris that was left behind. This is taken from the bus that our group was traveling on. We were moving from the road, from the harbor, and coming back across the city. And earlier in this clip, you could see 3-story apartments that had debris on the top of them. Now the video is moving through the main part of the town. Everything that's missing is basically where residential housing used to be. Wood frame housing that's been stripped all the way down to the foundation. Only steel frame buildings, the skeletons of those remain, and a few reinforced concrete buildings. We had evidence in all of the communities of major debris clearing that was going on everywhere. We saw lots of areas where debris was being cleared for roadways to allow removal of material. Here in Minamisanriku, there were 3 river channels that came into the city, and as we'll see a little bit later, those provided an entryway for the tsunami to come and penetrate deeply into the city. We also saw just the remains of business districts in areas like this. I also got this clip from the opposite side of the bus, looking at the hospital that was right down facing the harbor in Minamisanriku. This is the emergency room entrance, and you can see a steel frame, probably from a large sign or a building, that's wrapped around the entrance there. The water penetrated all the way to almost the top of the 4th floor on the portion of the building on the right, and then anyone who was able to evacuate up to the top of this 5th floor, the 5th floor structure, were the only survivors. And then this is really showing us this area as we drove out of town, heading back up into the valleys at the back of the city. And what you can see here is still lots of debris that's being cleared and staged. There are a number of trees in the background that are brown, that have been killed by the salt water. We saw these kinds of brown bathtub rings around these areas where there may not have been damage, but it would show where salt water had penetrated up into these areas. And then lastly, this video clip has this very brief view here of a little 7-Eleven truck. On NHK television the week we were there, it was talking about these 7-Eleven trucks that were showing up in the damaged areas, where it was some of the first instances of businesses coming back in and getting a foothold into areas that had been devastated. These were usually these national or multinational businesses like 7-Eleven that had resources to do this, but this was to provide some small goods through a refrigerated truck and a canopy to both the neighborhoods that didn't have damage, which if you were out of the tsunami zone, you were fairly undamaged, and then also to people who were working there at the site. So that's just a very brief video clip that's meant to introduce this presentation. I've titled this Magnitude 9 Paradigm Shift because for me, this is all about getting it, about understanding what this means for the Pacific Northwest. Prior to March 11th, for the most part, the Japanese scientists and the public didn't anticipate or understand that there was a capacity for a magnitude 9 earthquake tsunami to affect their area. Although they were highly prepared and have done so much mitigation and have some of the heaviest levels of investment in their infrastructure for protection, most of this are for smaller scale earthquakes and certainly smaller scale tsunamis. And so they've had to make a magnitude 9 paradigm shift based on a reaction, based on the fact that this has happened and they weren't anticipating it. For us, especially Oregon, we have less seismicity certainly than Japan, but also than California or Washington. And the implication is that since while we don't have as much investment in seismic strengthening and tsunami countermeasures like they do, we do have an understanding that we will have a magnitude 9. But in reality, our cultures, our governments, our communities have really not made this paradigm shift yet to understand that this is indeed a fabric of being here. And the question I ask at the beginning of this presentation, and it's basically how I conclude, is what is it going to take for us to make this magnitude 9 paradigm shift? Can we do it before we have our event, or do we have to wait until the event happens in order to integrate this understanding into how our communities are developed? So there's been a lot of people asking about the earthquake damage that occurred there. Certainly there was. Our group was primarily focused on the impacts due to the tsunami. I have just this single image that I'm using as a representation just right up front to say in Sendai and Ishinomaki and a number of cities inland of where the tsunami was, we saw small-scale damages, damages that certainly would reflect low levels of damage for such a large earthquake. A lot of it was cosmetic to buildings. It wasn't structural. There was evidence of liquefaction, as you see in this image where the sidewalk has buckled and sank, and there's been sand and gravel pushed out. But I'm just putting this here as more or less a placeholder for the fact that we witnessed it, but most of our emphasis was on the complete level of intense damage that came from the tsunami event. Here's an outline of the major points that I want to cover. These are also the major points for the report that I mentioned that EERI has published from our group. And the big issue here, as an emergency manager speaking, especially to other emergency managers and people who work in government, is this connection that government has, and especially emergency management has, to each of these categories. And this goes from the local government level through the state and or the prefecture level in Japan up to the national level. There's a great deal of investment beforehand, during, and after an event, and all of these areas were for the most part overwhelmed in their planning for what they anticipated would be a probable event rather than a possible event. Our group started in northern Iwate Prefecture in Kuji, and we traveled south over a 5-day period. We visited a number of communities, 12 in fact. Some of them we just simply drove through. Others we spent quite a bit of time and met with local government, state government, even the national government in Ishinomaki, or I should say in Sendai. And these numbers certainly are not current. These are numbers that came from our direct research and the research that was available to us at the time. I should also acknowledge that there's a lot of work and research and results that have come out since our publication came out in August. And so, again, I want to just say that what this presentation is about is really reflecting certainly my direct observations and the report that this is referenced from, but it still provides a very strong basis for a lot of discussion points for communities in the Northwest, on the coast especially. One of the things that came up a lot when we were there talking with our Japanese colleagues that hosted us were what were going to be the disaster plans going forward. And right around the time that we were leaving to come back to the United States and Canada, there were, I should say, this report came out. This is just a reference to it in this newspaper article, but the big issue was that Japan was very publicly acknowledging that their planning was insufficient, certainly at a national level, but the implications and acknowledgments go all the way down to the prefecture and local level. And it was no small thing for the Japanese government to make this very public acknowledgement and basically say that they have to start over in regards to planning for future magnitude 9 events and trying to understand where those possibilities are. But this certainly says a lot for us about whether our disaster plans are adequate or accurate enough for the magnitude 9 events that are in our future. I don't have a lot of technical slides in this presentation, but this is one I wanted to just quickly refer to. All of these fault segments that you can see off of this off the shoreline of Japan were basically what the estimations were for either maximum and or probable earthquakes on each of these segments. And you can see a number of them are in the 7.5 to 8s. There aren't any there that are laid out or dedicated to being a potential magnitude 9. But in fact, this area that just popped up in the circle on the slide represents that there were actually multiple fault segments that ruptured on March 11th, not a single one. And this is the basis for how much the underestimation was for what the largest possible event could be along the Sanriku coastline. And in fact, it was a very complex rupture, and I think there's a lot of implications for the Pacific Northwest and Cascadia in terms of how well we actually understand subduction zone fault behavior as well, that we need to pay close attention to. One of the biggest takeaways that our group had was this whole idea of underestimating the hazard, not putting all your eggs basically on the middle of the bell curve where the probabilities are. But if you don't take into account these outliers that are on the far end of that bell curve, and you're wrong about that assumption, then all of your other planning and protective measures are going to be subject to failure. One example I wanted to share is this one about the tsunami warning system. These are some slides from the Japan Meteorological Agency, but they just highlight how robust their detection and warning system is. A lot of it's based on their seismic arrays that they have, but they're very good and quick about getting these warnings issued, especially for areas right along where the epicenter is, which is where the X is. So within 4 minutes, they promptly got a warning out for 3 meters along the affected area. But the problem being that 4 minutes, the earthquake was actually still rupturing. And so there's a 7.9 that's listed at the top of the map. And I think that was, for the fault segment that they believe ruptured, that was the biggest earthquake that they had set up for that area. 28 minutes later, they probably had a number of remote sensing detections coming in from either sea gauges or GPS. Anyway, they were aware that they needed to revise this upwards from what they originally did. And then 45 minutes later was when they finally went to 10 meters and probably greater for the affected areas, but by 45 minutes, that's actually when the tsunami was making landfall in most locations. And we learned that in a number of places, the last warning that most people heard was the one that came at the very beginning within 4 minutes. And I think many people chose either not to evacuate because of they trusted the seawalls or felt like that wasn't a serious threat, or that evacuating to an area that seemed safe but was inadequate, either for vertical evacuation or going inland but not far enough. So I opened up this presentation with a short video clip from Minamisanriku, and I'm going to use a few images from this community just to really drill a little bit deeper into this event, and especially for emergency managers. This is an image taken prior to the event, and I think it really shows an idyllic coastal community that's probably functioning at a very high, sustained level for its scale in terms of the aquaculture that it has, in terms of tourism, in terms of having regional rail service. I'm sure it was a very nice place to live and to visit. This pink inundation area that is in the center in the red box is showing the mapped tsunami inundation zones that were put together in the days and weeks following the event. Let's see. My advancer is not moving. Here we go. So I apologize for the delay. This is an aerial photograph that was taken within a couple of days of the tsunami event, and it's very striking to see the extent of not only the inundation, but how it's annihilated pretty much the entire built environment in the areas where the tsunami reached. Looking down from the lower right and going across, you can see the 3 apartment buildings in the lower right-hand corner where the video started. It tracked kind of diagonally through the area and crossing the 3rd bridge, and then we drove in front of where the hospital is. And it's still very hard for me to let go of the feelings I had of just being overwhelmed when I was there, even if it was just for a few hours, trying to imagine our coastal communities having to pick up the pieces again and move forward. One of the things that we were paying attention to, and I know it's going to be a source of a lot of future investment, is this idea of vertical evacuation. We were looking around for examples of vertical evacuation, especially that had performed and had provided a refuge for people. This is an apartment or a condominium that faces the harbor there at Minamisanriku, and while you can see how high the debris and water lines were on the building, it did provide refuge for a number of people on the roof overnight. You can see this large fenced gate that goes around the perimeter. Well, I think I'm going to have to close a video clip if I'm going to proceed, because I think my computer's hanging up a little bit. I don't know if this is part of the interface or if it's just my machine right here. Well, I'm not next. Let's see if that goes. There we go. I may have to do this via my mouse. Sorry again for the delay. This is a shot looking back across that same condominium or apartment building looking back towards the city. And what I want to emphasize here about the challenges of vertical evacuation is that anyone who elects to stay and seek survival, basically, on a building like this on the rooftop, is that you're still inside the tsunami hazard area. You're still potentially going to be exposed to an unknown level of the hazard in that area, albeit flooding, albeit fires, albeit aftershocks. For many of the people, or I should say certainly in Minamisanriku, this event happened in late afternoon, and right at nightfall it started snowing. And the people who were on the rooftop who had to cling to the rooftop as waves broke and in some cases surged over the, through their legs over the rooftop. I'm sure it was a harrowing night of surviving and then having to be rescued the next day because the buildings were so littered with debris that they couldn't even get out. And so the design factors that we have for areas that we're going to designate as tsunami refuges seriously have to consider the level of uncertainty we have in the event we're facing, and so they need to build in additional degrees of clearances and tolerances for an event such as this. Likewise, in Oregon, we're looking at options for pathways to high ground. There were a number of locations that had temples that were built just up these hillsides and had stairways, and a number of examples of where people were able to use these stairways to seek high ground and get out of harm's way. I know in Oregon, especially, a number of the steeper beaches. If you're out on the beach looking back, it's not always clear exactly where you would go in an emergency to find your way to a designated tsunami evacuation area. And it's one thing that we may do to invest in these types of pedestrian bridges and walkways to ensure safe evacuation for people. So this is the Emergency Operations Center in Minamisanriku. It was right in the heart of the city, kind of behind the hospital, away from the harbor, but it was in an area that was residential and business. It's a 3-story steel-frame structure, and I'm sure many of you have heard the stories here. I just wanted to quickly recount it for those who haven't, especially when it comes to the role not only of the emergency officials in the town, but many of the public officials who work for this community. These photographs were taken from the roof after the tsunami had started to come into the town via the river channels. This is looking, if you can see the Tsunami Tower, one of the warning towers in the center here. This is looking to the left at about 6 or 7 o'clock from the roof. The 12 o'clock would be looking out straight at the harbor. This is a photograph looking back from one of the hillsides, and you can see in the foreground on the right a number of people who have evacuated to the roof of the EOC. The hospital is in the background, and even in the further distance, you can see through the dust and haze the tsunami evacuation building. In this photograph, the tsunami waters are starting to penetrate inland. This is just a close-up of people who are still evacuating onto the roof from the EOC and other areas of the city. I think about 30 staff from the city had chosen to take refuge on the roof of the EOC. This is another photo taken by a member of the group that was on the roof, looking at about 10 or 11 o'clock. The river in the diagonally across the picture is starting to be a conduit for all of the debris that's being the smashed houses that are being washed in. Probably seconds later, this is the river channel that's completely inundated, and homes and buildings that are being swept away that just adjacent almost to the EOC. And then this is a photograph taken from the top of the EOC looking out towards the harbor as pretty much the entire city is overwhelmed and underwater as the waves are crashing and breaking across the roofline of this three-story building. This photograph is very dramatic, and it shows the staff members who are basically hanging on for their lives, both on the antenna mast and at the top of the railings of the fire escape stairs. And then you can see the hospital in the background, at least the wing that was overwhelmed all the way to its top story. And then this is the final photo during the event as the first inundation was starting to recede. Only 10 of the 30 who evacuated actually survived at least the initial inundation. I had read an article of Jin Sato, the mayor who survived, and he said that they basically clung to life throughout the night and had to find things like their neckties to burn to try to keep warm until daybreak, when they had to climb down all of the debris to get to the ground. Miki Endo at the bottom of the screen has become a national hero for remaining at her post until the very last minute, calling to people from the loudspeakers for people to evacuate. And so this is a photo that I took the day we were there. This is showing what remains of the EOC. And I understand that the mayor is intending to leave this as it is, as remembrance of both the victims who died while they were on duty, but also as a permanent reminder to never forget that this happened and that it could happen again. It's a very strong statement compared, I think, to some of the other memorial markers that were in town for the Chile event from 1960. But this also is where I want to begin talking about the impacts to local government following a disaster, and that when we used a term in our team when we were there, very respectfully, but saying that the local government was basically decapitated by this event in so many areas, and without local government, the community members had to improvise, had to fend for themselves, had to wait for prefecture-level assistance to come in, and in many cases it was a while before they had national-level assistance too. Likewise, in Miyako, this is a photo showing a single-engine fire station that was overwhelmed, and I didn't see any evidence in the area that we were in whether they had any remaining fire service for that area. I'm not sure, but it still, makes the case of having your fire service district office in the hazard zone and it's taken out. It really removes a very important, critical role of government to be there to perform immediately following this event. And this occurred in a number of areas where we saw. For example, here in Kamaishi, this is the Central Police Headquarters that was located adjacent to the harbor. And if you can see the kind of the bridgeway between the two sections of the building, there's a car that's wedged up there. This facility was closed due to tsunami inundation damage, and they ended up using the parking lot as a sorting yard for damaged cars. We were very fortunate, and especially relied heavily on our local Japanese colleagues, our research counterparts, to set up a lot of interviews and time that we could spend with local officials just talking about what the issues were that they were dealing with, that they had been dealing with. And in Ishinomaki City Hall, we spent a fair amount of time talking about how long it took for them to resume service at a city function. And they said they were out of service about 1 month because they basically had standing contaminated tsunami salt water in their building for the better part of a week. But this is a big problem for a jurisdiction that needs to quickly start doing a whole list of emergency operations for their people, such as disaster registration and trying to track where people are in shelters and register people whose homes have been lost or damaged or need inspections. It was a month out before they basically were able to get this up and running again, and they had said that they really had a lot of people that they really couldn't account for in terms of where they were. You know, a huge number of their population had been dispersed across the area, either in the prefecture or other areas with friends or relatives or in shelters. I had even asked about continuity planning for the government when we were there, and they had said, well, that's something that usually is done by businesses, but the gentleman who was giving us the tour didn't at the time say that or acknowledge that that's something that governments have a role to have in terms of having redundancy for their services. We went to a school that had been turned into a shelter immediately after the tsunami. They had flooding up to the roof of their first floor, and there were, I think, about 75 evacuees who were there. Many of them had been there since the event, or for about 100 days. And one of the things, in any number of issues that were being relayed to us, was how challenging it was to transition these people out of the shelters. That many of these people were older, and they had a reluctance to leave the shelters because it meant they would have to give up a certain level of service they came to be accustomed to, especially with their life being so disrupted, and the responsibilities that they would have to take on when they would go to short-term housing. And so this meant that it took longer for the school to be reoccupied by students instead of evacuees. In terms of short-term housing, we were told that they estimated about 70,000 units would be ultimately necessary, and by late June they had about half of those assembled. In Japan, the local prefecture, the prefecture is responsible for the contracts to get these put in, but it's the local community that has the responsibility for siting these facilities, for getting power and water, gas, electricity, sewage, any number of things tied into these areas. And when local government is knocked off its feet, it means that there were probably a lot of delays or the need for the prefecture to have to assume the responsibility for this. So it's impressive nonetheless what they were able to accomplish, but they were still having a very hard time meeting the needs that they had. Another thing was basically locating these areas. You know, there's not a lot of usable, buildable land in this area of Japan because it's so mountainous that most of the communities are settled on the prime land, and that's been in many places destroyed by the tsunami. And so finding areas where you can stage short-term housing was very challenging. But once people would relocate to these areas, one of the other big issues was that these people are isolated. That a lot of these housing, short-term housing areas are in places where they're not necessarily next to surviving business districts or schools, that there's limited bus service to these places, and most people have lost their cars in the event, so they have little or no means for getting around too. And so they were physically isolated and culturally isolated, and it just meant another added hardship for a lot of people to go and move into these short-term housing areas, which we were told were estimated to be used for maybe 2 to 3 years, but we think it may be longer than that. We were also very privileged to have a couple of meetings with social welfare offices talking about vulnerable populations in the area. There's a lot of demographic research that I'm sure people have seen, at least references to the high percentage of people who were seniors there, and so therefore they represented high degrees of both the mortality and the people who were displaced. And this in itself is a challenge for people needing medications where they've lost medical records, any number of things that was a huge level of care that was necessary for a lot of these people. But we also had a very strong interaction with one of the groups that were there, a non-government organization that worked with people with disabilities, and they were just saying how challenging and frustrating it's been for them to go into these shelters and into these local communities and try and seek out people that they've had registered for needs, for people with mobility issues or hearing or blindness or diabetes, any number of things that they would be typically on a day-to-day basis providing care for. But the existing privacy laws that were in place by Japan prevented these shelters or governments from disclosing the names of who these people were. And it makes me ask or wonder whether or not this is an issue that will be a hindrance for us too in our disaster registry system. I gave a briefing just the other week to our medical examiner's office because they're interested in doing mass casualty planning, and this was something that I had found that in Japan, traditionally cremations are how funeral services are done, and that between the damage to the facilities and the number of people who had been killed, hundreds in many communities, they didn't have the means to properly have services, so they were having to do these very organized burials in these trenches to go back and later exhume the dead for the loved ones to have a formal service at a future date. But how we manage the casualties for our coastline is something that there has to be serious planning for as well. And debris management comes up over and over again in terms of the monumental scale of what to do with all of this material. And I have the slide listed for coastal Oregon, but it can certainly apply anywhere along the Pacific coast for one of these events. And the challenges of what to do with all of this, especially when you've got contaminated material, when some of it has hazardous waste, it's no small thing to sort and find future long-term housing for this stuff. This is an air photo just showing this kind of a mat of damaged homes, splintered homes that had been pushed by the tides a couple of days out into an inlet, and is at least illustrative of all of the debris that's out in the Pacific circling and I'm sure causing lots of different consequences environmentally for the type of material that's out there. This is also an illustration of the kind of sorting yards that we passed numerous times, and the downed utility pole that's in the foreground is very indicative of the fact that everything that touched salt water is basically corroding, and so not only does the pole have to be replaced, but all of the electrical lines, whether they're underground or above, it's not one thing just to have these facilities damaged, but the salt water and the contaminated salt water issues just further compound all of the work that's involved in both the cleanup and the reconstruction. And a lot of the debris was basically unseen. So much of the material that was damaged was also drawn down with the tsunami out into the bays and harbors. And so this photo was when we were right there in Miyako having a briefing by the prefecture officials, and this kind of stuff was still being dredged up from the bottom of the harbor, and you can just imagine the kind of material and the potential problems that lurk unseen under the water surface all along the Japanese coast. And then volunteers. Volunteer management is always a real important job, but it's also a big responsibility for emergency managers and non-government organizations after a disaster. This Ishinomaki University, the Senshu University, was just in the process of getting a memorandum of understanding underway when the event hit, and although since they were unaffected, they decided to go ahead and stage this area where volunteers could come, and they had to camp or basically sleep in their cars in order not to displace people from areas of lodging. But I took this shot at one of these kind of a training buildings, and I think it's just important to realize also how much work and materials have to be mobilized to utilize volunteers effectively, and training that goes on. On the left hand, this poster kind of illustrates all of the different conditions that these volunteers will face when they're out in the field trying to clean up houses and different areas. You don't know what level of training or education or dependability you have, and so managing volunteers in a situation like this is a huge undertaking. We were just talking about what would it take to get tetanus shots for all of these people before they're going out and being exposed to this, and that single thing is a huge public health workload following a disaster. And so the reconstruction and recovery conversations were really just getting underway when we were there about 3 months out. Debris clearing and the later phases of the response were basically winding up. And this is a slide that just illustrates this kind of a concept in that box that the communities really needed to embrace, they have to live with the sea and earth in these areas, but that they need to come back in and create a sense of what hometown means to be there, and to try and start addressing what the issues are and the necessities for rehabilitation in all of these different sectors of their communities. Land use especially was the center of the conversation in terms of how do you go back in and reestablish these kinds of hierarchies, I guess, spatially, of where do you have your residential and your industrial and the port, and do you rebuild your breakwater wall to a higher level now? Do you have these different types of systems to provide protection and evacuation for different residential areas? This is just yet again another kind of a conceptual diagram that shows a number of different kind of situations where you may have a broad plain, or you may have steep mountain areas where you have to make cut slopes to reestablish housing, or you have elevated areas, or you use debris to build these levees to create kind of protective berms. All of these types of things were basically a part of the conversation of how do these communities reestablish themselves. And likewise for our coastal communities, these are conversations that would best be had prior to an event happening, rather waiting till after, and you're dealing with all of the rest of the complications. And so I just have a few slides that I had gotten from this Andrew Burton photo site. He's a USA Today photographer, but I thought they're very powerful in this whole step that people have to take when they re-enter the disaster zone and have to start trying to assess what their next steps are, picking up the pieces of what once was their day-to-day lives and trying to find this pathway of what is next. And if local government has been destroyed or severely impacted, it's very hard for these people to have a real sense of framework or guidance on what to do. I know there were a number of places that had moratoriums on rebuilding, but you can only imagine the need for having public process right now to reach out and work with these people and help to give them some sense of hope and guidance as they're working through this, picking their lives and getting everything back into place. Also, people having to improvise, whether or not these people are siphoning gas to power their vehicle or to use as fuel. I think it's just a stark reminder on, how basically people were still struggling in late winter to get by in areas where there was very little assistance for a long time. And then this image, I guess to me, is the one that leads into the closing here about disaster recovery planning. If you don't have a pre-disaster recovery plan, you're really just, striding into the unknown because it's so important to try and frame at least what your goals and objectives are going forward before the disaster happens. Otherwise, you're really dealing with so many political issues and the challenges from all directions in terms of to go back to whatever normal was before and what you're going to base your decisions on. It's so important to have some sense of a plan that's there for you when this occurs. This is, I think, it's a nice article that I kept referring back to, and I wanted to just call the attention back to Minamisanriku, where this little community basically had nothing, and the mayor was just saying it's so hard to start over with nothing, where some communities had portions of their economic sector intact. They had areas of their residential housing that were intact. They had major highways or port facilities. They were able to leverage what they did have to get more back in. And for a community like theirs, they're just struggling basically with without anything to leverage. And these towns are just kind of stuck in limbo, as the article says, in trying to get people back in town, to get commitments to go forward, and to get businesses to make commitments to get back in place too. And so in basically wrapping up, pre-disaster recovery planning is something that I know Crew has been invested in since at least 2006 when I was more involved with them. We held a Cannon Beach workshop back then, and I think one of the biggest takeaways for me was really to have a visioning process for the community about how they would see their community following the disaster, that even having some goals in place of how you would do it differently is a lot more to work with than starting with nothing. But these plans certainly need to be very public in the participatory process, and then you definitely need to have consensus on what decisions are, because those decisions will be contested. But if at least you can demonstrate that the work that went into creating this plan was legitimate and vetted, it really will help as a roadmap going forward. The statements at the bottom, I think, are based on my opening comments. What's it going to take for us to have our paradigm shift? That someday it will have already happened, and then we will understand and know. But until then, we are the first generation and of the modern age that really understands that this is happening. And so it's really a responsibility of ours to try and make a difference and to promote some sense of getting this paradigm shift integrated into the fabric of our societies. And so one example I wanted to conclude with is that OSPAC, Oregon Seismic Safety Policy Advisory Commission, has been named as the the lead for the Oregon Cascadia Earthquake and Tsunami Disaster Resilience Plan. It was adopted by the legislature about a month after the Tohoku event, and that we're just now working out our strategy, meeting with the governor's policy advisor to start trying to plan the best approach for presenting this both to the legislature and the governor's office. That initially we were just saying this needs to be a 50-year approach. That there's nothing you're going to achieve overnight. That we really have to just start investing and making commitments and taking these sustained steps forward. But we really wanted to make sure that this plan isn't framed as an emergency management issue. That it really, I felt like especially, it wouldn't get a lot of traction if it was seen simply as a disaster. That it really has to be grounded in more of the sustainability movement, the same way that energy efficiency and water issues, all of those long-term issues that are in the 20 and 40-year planning range for communities, that this Cascadia event needs to be a part of the decision-making in the public and private development sectors. That we've been looking at the SPUR Disaster Resilient City model. Chris Poland from Degenkolb Engineers had recently given us a presentation on it, and I think the challenge for us is how do you scale that from a city that's 7 by 7 miles up to a state, or at least the western portion of that state. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from their outline, but we certainly need to make it our own. We're currently seeking to build an advisory panel of stakeholders, and we want their input as well as their support when we do go to the legislature and the governor. And that, I guess lastly, just realizing for us who are working on this, that trying to have a proactive approach to this is going to be slow. That as someone who is a hazard mitigation coordinator, and I've done this all my professional life, that these kinds of proactive steps are always hard-fought successes at getting them implemented. That they don't happen overnight, and it's all about building this kind of a culture of doing things this way. So that's my last slide. I'm coming in right at about 11 o'clock. And so I'm going to turn this over to Heidi as the moderator. If people have submitted questions, certainly for me, I'm able to answer them, or also, I guess, if there's any questions for crew as well.
Yes, Jay, this is Heidi. We haven't received any questions so far, so if there are any questions, please feel free to go ahead and send them in via the question and answer area on your desktop. Did everybody hear that okay? We have one question, Jay, and it is, what is the long-term prognosis for recovery in Japan?
Well, I'll have to first just admit I haven't been investing a lot of time tracking the current research that's been going on for the long-term recovery there. Aside from just articles that I read and people like Claire Rubin, who has a wonderful blog called Recovery Diva, who's putting posts intermittently on there. I think if you look at a place like Kobe from the 1995 event, 10 years is usually kind of a benchmark for recovery. But I think that it's any of the individual cities, it's probably hard to compare them. I think a place like Kesennuma, I think I've read, is is leveraging this event to do changes for economic downturns they'd had in their tourism, and looking at smart ways of rebuilding their areas. A lot of these places have been affected by coastal subsidence, and so many of their districts, agriculture, are now in the area that's inundated at high tide. And so I think even 9 months out, I think there are still a lot of decisions for the Japanese communities to make. And I think this is one thing that we really, as local emergency officials, local public officials, we need to start working with the researchers who are out there to better understand what the decision points are for these people. Where are the timelines, and what are the issues that they're having to consider at certain crossroads? And so I'll leave it right there.
Jay, there's another question, and they asked, what are they doing with all the debris in Japan?
Again, as a local emergency manager, I haven't really been afforded the time to dedicate to do sustained and continued research on Japan specifically, other than trying to bring the issues they're dealing with here for the jumping off point for conversations. So knowing that they had between 23 and 25 million tons of debris, I think they've got long-term challenges on how they're going to manage and recycle. I guess I would say optimistically, I did see a lot of effort when we were there at that they were doing towards recycling. And it was impressive to see the level of staging that was going on. I think probably we will be able to learn a lot as time progresses for us in terms of the way that they've managed this, especially when they have such limited areas for disposing of this material.
Here's another question, Jay. While you were in Japan, did you learn anything about the health and medical infrastructure and the tsunami's impact on it?
Our group, while we asked a few questions about the greater health sector, and we actually had an interview in Minamisanriku with a local professor, along with some of the fishermen who were there, just talking about the impacts to their hospital and what that's meant to them 3 months out to not have a hospital facility in the area. But you know, looking at it at a national scale, it was an area that our group didn't specifically have a directive to look at. I'm sorry, my wife's a public health nurse too, and this was one thing that we've continued to try and keep our eyes open in terms of, you know, what changes there may be in place for certainly siting hospitals in areas prone to tsunami inundation, as well as surge capacity and, you know, regional levels of support in the big disasters like this.
Here's another comment. It's interesting to see some of the buildings that withstood tsunami forces, particularly steel and concrete. Do you know what peak ground accelerations those buildings withstood during the earthquake itself?
I know that there were areas that had fairly high, you know, very strong ground accelerations. I think some of them were inland, actually, but individually for some of those buildings, I don't know. I mean, I think if you know, just looking at the photographs that were taken prior to the tsunami, most of the built environment survived just fine, at least in terms of, you know, not having serious collapses. So I think based on their continued investments in building codes, and the fact that a lot of the videos and personal accounts that the ground shaking was long rolling and sustained, but not violent. That I think it wasn't the earthquake that did all the damage. It was the tsunami that came in afterwards.
Another question, and can you discuss how local PGAs factored into the consequences of the Tohoku seismic event? Or did we just talk about that?
Yeah, well, here again, our group didn't really focus much on the impacts from the earthquake event. I would just say in fact, our group was really as primarily social scientists who were on this group, and we're looking at the effects to government and to society in general. That there is so much information that is out there on both the geophysical dimensions of the earthquake event as well as the engineering aspects. EERI has a site dedicated to the Tohoku event, and that's primarily what they're tracking and providing resources for. And I would even expect that the AGU conference in San Francisco this week has probably got a lot of emphasis on that. So I just have to acknowledge that our group was primarily there to look at people as opposed to the performance of buildings.
And then there is one question, I believe it's specifically about the Oregon governor. Have you had a chance to give this presentation to Governor Kitzhaber's public safety advisor, Cameron Smith, and their group?
No, I have not directly. I know he's someone that the chair of OSPAC and I have reached out to and spoken to, and we're going to be meeting with him next week, actually a week from today, to go over this. And given the opportunity, we would really much like to have a chance to share either this or some portion of our collective both images and materials from the Japan event as a placeholder for starting our discussion on our resiliency plan.
Okay. If there was one message you would like Oregon and regional businesses to take away, what would that be?
Really it would be about, start with what you can in terms of making an investment towards the future of the reality that this event will someday happen. And giving public presentations every year to people who do get overwhelmed by the intensity of this message. I always say just prepare for, the annual things, the winter storms and the floods, and that gives you a leg up at least on being personally prepared. As for businesses and communities, I think it's really about establishing these linkages, getting to know one another and what your roles and responsibilities are. Start working on continuity plans and recovery plans. And really, ideally, it would be good for communities to tie their recovery planning and back to what their existing mitigation plans have already identified as vulnerabilities. In many ways, the existing hazard mitigation plans that they're required to have are a very good framework for starting with where they think their challenges might be in the future.
Okay. And then maybe this will be the last question, Jay. In terms of catastrophic events, are there any significant lessons learned or differences between the Japan earthquake response and recovery and the U.S. response recovery efforts associated with Katrina?
Well,
it's a hard one.
It is, well, depending on which direction you want to go. I think both of these really definition of a catastrophe above and beyond a disaster, where all of the local, state, or prefecture level and then national level plans and assets are not enough to meet the needs. And certainly that was true in how responses were brought in for Katrina in terms of having the level of damage that was at such a regional extent and such a concentrated area. But for the Sanriku coast, we met with the second or third in command for their disaster preparedness office. He was like their response director, and he was acknowledging how their national plans had always basically trained and operated with the assumption that they would only have to work at one prefecture at a time, that they hadn't really developed a plan to have to go in and work at the prefecture level in 2 or 3 at a time, or even 4, I think. And of course, the nuclear incident complicated that even further. But certainly, it's good that FEMA is starting to pay more attention to the Cascadia event. Certainly, just like they are with New Madrid, they're having these plans that involve multiple states instead of single states. And I think that's at least the basis for trying to have the assumptions operate on a much broader level in terms of the scale of national resources that are going to be necessary, not just regional.
Well, thank you, Jay. This is Josh again. I want to thank everybody who participated in the webinar today and stayed on for questions. Again, this is the first in a series of webinars on mitigation and recovery that CREW will be hosting over the next year. We don't have a date yet, but in February, John Schilling with Washington Emergency Division will be giving a presentation. And then again in April, Taryn Moore with Emergency Management British Columbia will be giving a presentation on cost-benefit analysis. So please stay tuned for more information, specific information about those dates. We encourage you to participate in those in future webinars. And also, just a reminder, this Jay Wilson's presentation will be posted to the CREW website. So if you want to share it with others or view it again, you'll be able to do so by finding it at the CREW website, www.crew.org. Again, Jay, I want to thank you for agreeing to be our lead-off speaker on this series. I think it's extremely important for communities up and down the West Coast within the Cascadia subduction zone to get engaged in this paradigm shift, to be thinking about planning for catastrophic events like this at the community level, at the government level, at the business level now, so we don't have the same kinds of issues that Japan is experiencing in terms of just not knowing which direction to go. So I appreciate you taking the time to go over there and bring the information back, and CREW looks forward to partnering with you and other states that are working on these efforts in the future. And we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Heidi. Thank you, everyone who attended.